بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Today's lecture is concerning one of the greatest companions of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even before he was a great commander of a Muslim army, one of the great commanders of Islam, he was first and foremost, a while before this, a great individual and a great companion of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as is mentioned in the hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah Azza wa Jal looked into the hearts of men. He looked into the hearts of people before they were created. And He chose the best and the most honorable and the most noble and the most purest of hearts to be His Prophet and Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then He chose the next most purest and noble hearts to be His companions radiyallahu anhum. And this is in itself a great virtue for the companions radiyallahu anhum. And this hadith is referring to the other prophets of Allah and the other messengers of Allah, for they were better than the companions. But the hadith refers to this ummah, our nation, that the best of hearts in this time, before this time, after this time, is the heart of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is no one more noble, more honorable, more beloved to Allah Azza wa Jal, more higher and closer in the sight of Allah than our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then in order to facilitate and help the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to achieve his goal, to spread his message, to convey the message of Islam, Allah Azza wa Jal chose for him a group of people. And these people were not chosen because they were strong, or because they were rich, or because they belonged to a certain tribe, or because they were honorable in a different way according to the standards that we have. They were chosen because they had pure hearts. And so because of this purity, Allah Azza wa Jal chose them to accompany His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And anyone that studied seerah, anyone that studied the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam will immediately know the reason behind this and the wisdom behind this. It's very plain, it's very clear, it's very simple. And that wisdom, or one of the greatest wisdoms behind this, is because these people would be the fortress of Islam. They would be the ones after Allah Azza wa Jal to protect the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They would be the ambassadors of Islam. They would be the ones to remain steadfast with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through ease and hardship, through thick and thin. Imagine if we, for example, were chosen to be the companions in our current state. When you look around you, how people are with regards to their prayers, with regards to their fasting, with regards to their obligatory duties. Would we really have been able to measure up to the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Does anyone here trust themselves before they trust anyone else around them to have remained steadfast with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the likes of Badr and Uhud and Hudaybiyah and Tabuk and all of those other events that took place in his life? And so Allah Azza wa Jal chose them for a noble purpose. And because they were the purest of hearts, because they accompanied the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because of the greatness that they achieved, the greatness that they helped the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to achieve by the permission of Allah, then Allah has given them a great status of Islam. It is a sign of our iman, a sign of our belief that we love the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we honor them, that we revere them, that we follow their example. And that doesn't mean that if we find them contradicting a verse or a hadith, because they were humans and they made mistakes like everyone else, it doesn't mean that we follow their way. But what it means is that we give their understanding precedence over our own understanding. They lived with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They witnessed the revelation of the Quran. They understood the context in which incidents took place, the context in which verses were revealed. They understood the Arabic language far better than anyone else that came after them. And so their understanding is given precedence over our understanding. And so when we come to a verse of the Quran or a saying of the Prophet ﷺ that is ambiguous, that is perhaps not clear to us, that perhaps needs to be defined and needs to be clarified, then we go back to their understanding. Because this is why Allah chose them. And when you look at the spread of Islam from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how knowledge spread out, you will find that it all goes back to the scholars of the companions. The likes of Abdullah bin Abbas, and Abdullah bin Mas'ud, and Abdullah bin Umar, and Aisha, and Abu Hurairah, and many others of the companions who were known for teaching and known for spreading the religion. All of the understandings of the scholars, Imam Ahmad, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, a lot of it will go back in chain from one scholar to another to these great companions radiyallahu anhum. This is something which we're ordered to do in the Quran. It is a part of our religion that we maintain this path. وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولَ مِن بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى وَنُصْلِهِ جَهَنَّمَ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. Whosoever cuts off, breaks off from the way of the Prophet ﷺ, and he follows a path other than the path of the believers. Who are these believers? What is the path of the believers? A number of the scholars of tafsir said that path is the path of the companions. What they were upon, how they understood the religion, how they implemented the religion. Whosoever, Allah says, whosoever follows a path other than this path, then we will leave them for that which they have chosen. And we will make them enter the fire of hell, and what an evil destination. Why? Because when you divert from this understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, and you use your own intellect, or use the intellect of other people who didn't go back to their understanding, then that's when you'll have misguidance and innovation and mistakes. That's when you'll misinterpret things and you'll interpret them in a way that is incorrect. That's when you'll twist meanings, and instead of doing that which Allah ordered, you'll do the opposite of that. And so to follow the way of the believers is part of our religion. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ praised his companions. And before the praise of the Prophet ﷺ, Allah praised them in the Quran. And he said that he was pleased with them. رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with him. Allah testifies for all of them, whoever is a companion, that Allah is pleased with them. And what more does a person want than the pleasure of Allah? Because to gain the pleasure of Allah means that you gain His forgiveness and His mercy and His reward subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah is pleased with them. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in many ahadith, he speaks about his own pleasure for them. How he was pleased with his companions. Not only that, but no one who comes after them, even the least of them in stature, the least of them in station, the most junior of the companions, the youngest person who ever saw the Prophet ﷺ. Never did he speak to him, he didn't relay any ahadith, but he's a companion or she's a companion. Even they are far better than anyone who comes after them. The Prophet ﷺ said, if you were to give in charity the likes of the mountain of Uhud in gold, then it would not equal even a handful of what they gave, or half a handful. Won't even equal that. Give the whole of the mountain of Uhud. And the mountain of Uhud is not just a hill. It's not just the mountain of the arches that we see when we go for Umrah or Hajj. The mountain of Uhud is a range of mountains that covers the whole side of Medina. One whole region of Medina is shadowed by these mountains. It is a range of mountains that covers one side of Medina. If you were to give all of it in gold, it wouldn't even equal half a handful of that which they gave. Why? Not because the quantity is less. A mountain of gold is far more than a handful of gold. But it's because of their intention, because of their sincerity, because of their certainty in Allah, because of their trust in Allah. That is something which no one can equal. Doesn't matter how much you spend, what you do, never will your heart equal their hearts. And therefore never will your station equal their station. And that's why the scholars of Islam would say, even amongst the companions, that Abu Bakr radiallahu an, he wasn't better than the other companions because he necessarily spent more, or he did more ibadah, or he had more knowledge. But it was because of something which entered his heart, and it was something which his limbs confirmed to. They attested to its truthfulness because of what was in his heart. And only Allah Azza wa Jal knows what is in a person's heart. And so Allah Azza wa Jal gave the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam these great individuals. And so when we study their lives, we don't just study them because they're nice stories, because it's a nice lecture, because the biographies are something different that we want to hear. But we study them because we want to follow their way. We want to emulate them. We want to follow their example. These are the people that Allah chose to be the shining lights, to be the examples that we should follow after our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so that is our duty as a Muslim. And this is what the scholars were upon. All of the scholars, irrespective of which madhab, irrespective of which school of thought, the great scholars of Islam all agreed on this one principle, that you follow the way of the companions. And who would rather have their own opinion and give their own opinion and put it before the opinion of the likes of Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiyallahu anil jami' and the other great companions radiyallahu anhum. So today we're studying a life from amongst one of those lives, an example from one of those examples, a shining light and a beacon from those many beacons. And he was one of the greatest companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. While before he became a great commander and a great Muslim leader of an army, he was a great companion. One of the 10 that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam attested to that he will enter into Jannah. And even though Allah is pleased with all of the companions and Allah has promised them good, rarely did Allah or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mention someone by name that they will be entered into Jannah. This was rare. But from amongst those people were these 10 companions. And they are considered by the scholars of Islam to be the most senior and the best of the companions. Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and Abdul Rahman ibn Auf and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas and Az-Zubayr and Talha and Abu Ubaidah and Sa'id ibn Zayd. 10 companions that every single person should know. Everyone should have memorized their names. There is no one better in Islam after our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam than these 10. They are the best of companions. Not only was this companion from amongst those 10, but he was one of the early Muslims. One of the early Muslims to enter into Islam. Some of the narrations say that he was one of the first 7 people to enter into Islam. One of the earliest people to enter into Islam. Not only was he one of the first people to enter into Islam, but he was the last of these 10 great companions to pass away. The last of them to die. And according to some historians, he was the last of the Muhajirin to die, radiyallahu anhu. The last of those companions who migrated from Mecca to Medina. He was the last from amongst them to die, radiyallahu anhu. So who was this great companion? His name was Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. His father's name was Abu Waqqas. And Abu Waqqas was his title, it was his kunya. It wasn't his actual name. It was what people referred to him as. His actual name was Malik. And his father's name was Uhayb bin Abdi Manaf bin Zuhra bin Kilab. And Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, his kunya was Abu Ishaq. And he was from the tribe of Quraysh radiyallahu anhu wa arda. His mother, her name was Hamna bint Abi Sufyan. She was the first cousin of Abu Sufyan. The first cousin of Abu Sufyan, the daughter of his own uncle. And Abu Sufyan was the leader of Quraysh. He was the leader of Quraysh radiyallahu anhu, and he later became a Muslim. So his mother was the first cousin of Abu Sufyan. So he came not only from Quraysh, but from the most noble lineage of Quraysh. He was from the most respected clans of Quraysh. He was closely related to the leaders and the chiefs of Quraysh. His grandfather, the grandfather of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, a man by the name of Uhayb ibn Abdi Manaf, was the uncle, the paternal uncle of the mother of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Amina. So not only was he related to Abu Sufyan from one way, but from his father or from his grandfather he was related to the mother of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and therefore he was related to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would refer to him as his uncle, even though he was younger than him in age. He would call him Khali, which means my mother's brother, my maternal uncle. He would call him Khali. In Sunan al-Tirmidhi, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas coming to him one day, and he said, "Hada Khali, this is my uncle. So let someone else bring an uncle like him." Out of pride, out of showing the great virtue of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, this is my uncle. Let someone else bring an uncle like him, even though he was younger in age, younger than our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, due to his virtue, due to his status, due to him being one of the early Muslims in Islam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam praised him in this way. There are many different reports concerning his birth, but from amongst them is that he was born approximately 23-25 years before the Hijrah. So when he accepted Islam, he was still young in age. It is said that he was only 17 or 18 when he became a Muslim. Still a teenager, still in his youth. He became a Muslim at that age. As he grew up from a young age, he was known for his character. He was known to be someone that didn't meddle in the affairs of others. People were safe from his tongue, they were safe from his hand. He was someone who kept to his own business. He was someone who had foresight, someone that could see the implications and the ramifications of things that he would do. Someone known as Ba'idun Nazar, having foresight. He was someone who would stay away from difficulties and issues and trials. He wouldn't get involved in the trials between people, but he would keep himself to himself. But he was known to be courageous and to be brave and to be a leader. These were qualities that he had even from his youth. And some of the reports say that as he was growing up in Mecca, what he would do as a child and as a young man was that he would make arrows and bows. This was his job. He would assemble arrows and bows. And therefore, in order to test them, he would shoot them. So he became well known for shooting arrows and bows, for shooting arrows out of bows. And then he became well known for everything around warfare. So he was a horse rider and he became a warrior. And he was one of the warriors of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The historians describe him as someone well tanned. He was of dark complexion and he was short in height, but he was sturdily built. And he had broad shoulders and he had curly hair, radiyallahu anhu warda. So this is the background of this companion, radiyallahu anhu. And at the age of 17, he became a Muslim. And he was one of the earliest Muslims in Islam. When the Prophet ﷺ was given the message of Islam, he spread it to the closest people that he had. People like Khadija, people like Abu Bakr, people like Ali, radiyallahu anhum. And then Abu Bakr radiyallahu anh, and this is one of the great virtues of Abu Bakr, he went and he began to call his closest friends to Islam. And so from amongst them was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and Uthman, and Az-Zubayr, and Talha. And all four of these people that Abu Bakr invited to Islam and they accepted Islam by his invitation, all four of them are from amongst those 10 that are promised paradise. Subhanallah. Look at the great virtue of Abu Bakr. Not only does he bring these people to Islam, but they become so loyal and so determined and so committed in their Islam that they become from the most senior companions, from the best of the companions, radiyallahu anhum. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, even though he was only 17 at the time, 18 at the time, he accepted Islam by the invitation of Abu Bakr radiyallahu anhu. And when he accepted Islam, then his mother found out, she heard that he became a Muslim. And she became upset. And so she swore by Allah, she took an oath that she wouldn't eat until he apostated and left Islam. She would not eat, she would not drink until he left this religion. And obviously at the beginning of Islam, the Muslims were few in number and they were weak. They didn't have much money, they didn't have much manpower, they were weak. Many of them would pray in secret and they would keep their Islam quiet, or they would not go and preach it outwardly. And so the Quraysh, people's parents, people's relatives, they would use different means by which to entice them to apostate from Islam. So his mother said to him that I will not eat or drink by Allah until you leave Islam. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas said to her, "O my mother, you know me better than anyone, and you know that even if you were not to eat and drink and you were to die, and then Allah gave you another 100 souls, and each one of them was to leave your body like this, I will still never leave my religion." Subhanallah, look at this, at the age of 17 or 18. He just becomes a Muslim in a society where the vast majority of people are non-Muslims. And people frown upon this religion. They dispraise this religion. They look down upon this religion. They persecute and torture the people who accept this religion. And his mother is making an oath, one of the closest people to him, that I will die unless you leave your religion. And because of his true iman, because of his sincerity, and this is why he became one of those great companions radiyallahu an. He says, even if you had 100 souls and each one of them was to leave you because of starvation, I still wouldn't leave my religion. Radiyallahu an. And then Allah Azza wa Jal revealed the verse in the Quran regarding Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, where he said, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا وَإِنْ جَاهَدَاكَ لِتُشْرِكَ بِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا إِلَيَّ مَرْجِعُكُمْ فَأُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. And indeed from that which Allah has legislated is that a person be good and respectful towards their parents. But if they insist that you associate partners with Allah, then leave them. For indeed there is no obedience in this. Indeed to Allah you will return and He will inform you of your actions. So this famous verse of the Quran, that even if your parents are non-Muslims, you respect them and you obey them and you honor them unless they call you to leave your religion, unless they call you to disobey Allah. It was revealed concerning Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and his mother radiyallahu anhu arda. He was known for his bravery and his courage, even from a very young age. He was the first Muslim to draw blood. The first Muslim to draw blood. And the narration says that during that time at the beginning of Islam, the majority of the companions, they would go and pray together in jama'ah, in congregation. But they would go out of the way. They would go to the desert, or they would go to some valley, some place where people wouldn't frequent. Some place where you wouldn't see people, you wouldn't bump into them. And that's where they would pray together. And so one day Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and a number of companions went out of their way to go and to pray together. And as they were praying, some people from the non-Muslims, from the pagans, from the mushrikeen, they happened to pass by. And so when they saw that they were praying, they began to curse them, and they began to ridicule them, and they began to antagonize them. And so Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas saw the bone of a camel, and he picked it up and he threw it towards one of them. And because he was known for his military skill, he was known already even at this age for shooting arrows and so on, he hit the man dead set on his forehead. Hit him right on his forehead with the bone of a camel. And he began to bleed. He didn't die, he began to bleed, and then they ran off. And so he was the first person radiyallahu an to draw blood in Islam. He was also the first person to ever shoot an arrow in Islam for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As is mentioned when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent a small army. He sent a small regiment of people, a group of people under the leadership of Ubaidah ibn al-Harith radiyallahu an. And they went to Hijaz towards Mecca. And this was after they had migrated to Medina. And they wanted to go and they wanted to intercept some of the caravans of the Quraysh. So when they arrived at this place, they found that the caravan had already left. It was already leaving and they wouldn't be able to catch it. But Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas saw them leaving. So he shot towards them. He shot an arrow towards them. And it is said that he was the first person to shoot an arrow in Islam. Radiyallahu anhu wa arda. He was known as the guardian of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The guard of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the one who would guard him. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated from Mecca to Medina, and he came to Medina, and he was settling in Medina, he said, as Aisha radiyallahu anha reports, that one day the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sleeping. And before he fell asleep, he said, if only one of my companions would come and they would guard me tonight. They would come and they would guard me. And this was the practice at the beginning of the Islam, that the companions would guard the Prophet ﷺ during the night. And so he said this to Aisha, if only someone would come and guard me on this night. And so he heard someone drawing a sword, brandishing a sword. And so he said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who is this? And Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas replied, it is Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. And then Aisha says that the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he heard that Sa'ad had come to guard him, he fell asleep. And then after this, Allah Azza wa Jal revealed the verse of the Quran, Wallahu ya'simuka minan nas. It is Allah who will protect you from the people. And after the revelation of this verse, the Prophet ﷺ didn't take any gods, because Allah Azza wa Jal told him that he didn't need anyone else. Allah was sufficient as his protector, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam once made dua for Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, and he said, "Oh Allah, make every arrow that he shoots go straight," meaning make it hit his target, and make his du'as those that you answer. Radiyallahu an. So he was known as a great warrior. And the Prophet ﷺ made dua for his military skill. And he also made dua that Allah would answer his du'as. And so there are many narrations that speak about how he would make dua, and that dua would be answered immediately by Allah Azza wa Jal because of the dua that the Prophet ﷺ made for him. It was reported in one instance during the end of his life, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he came across a man, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, he came across a man who was cursing Ali radiyallahu an, and Talha radiyallahu an, and Zubayr radiyallahu an, three of the greatest companions of the Prophet ﷺ. The man was cursing them out loud. And so Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas said to him, if you don't stop cursing them, I will make dua against you. The man said, why do you threaten me as if you're a prophet? Why are you threatening me as if you're a prophet and Allah will answer your du'as, any dua that you make? And then he carried on cursing these companions. So Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas made dua, and he said, oh Allah, if this man is cursing those companions that you are already pleased with, because they had already passed away, that you are already pleased with, and he is cursing them, and his cursing of them is causing you to become angry, then make him a sign for all of the people. The narrator says, by Allah, as soon as he finished making that dua, a camel went wild, it went crazy, and it left its pen, and it came and it stamped upon him until he died. That man, due to the dua of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiyallahu anhu. A man that was known as Mustajab al-Da'wah. He was someone that Allah would answer his dua. And this in itself is a great virtue of a person. And the Prophet ﷺ mentioned this, that perhaps you will see someone that you consider to be ignoble, someone to be lowly, someone that you humiliate. But by Allah, were he to make dua, then Allah would answer his dua. And if that man was to take an oath, then Allah would fulfill his oath. Because no one knows the relationship between a person and Allah except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And no one knows what's in the heart of a person except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he was mustajab al-da'wah, someone whose dua was answered. He attended and participated in all of the great battles of Islam. Radiyallahu an. He was in the day, in one of the battles known as Buwat, which is one of the first battles ever fought in Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ, once he migrated to Medina, the strategy of the Muslims was to intercept the caravans of Quraysh, so that they could take back some of the wealth that was unlawfully taken from them. Because most of the Muslims left Mecca without any money or any belongings. The Quraysh wouldn't allow them to leave. So the Prophet ﷺ would try to intercept the caravans of Quraysh so that he could take from their wealth. So there was a battle known as Buwat, where the Prophet ﷺ came out with his companions to go and intercept a caravan. But when they arrived at the place where the caravan was supposed to pass, they found that it had already gone. So they missed it. So even though it is considered a battle, there was actually no fighting. And in that battle, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was the flag bearer. And the Prophet ﷺ, whenever he went for war, he would give one of his companions the honor of holding the flag of the Muslims. And in this first battle of Islam, it was Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiyallahu anhu. In the battle of Badr, he was there. And he was one of those 300 odd companions that stayed with the Prophet ﷺ and they fought. And not only that, but when they arrived in Badr and the Prophet ﷺ set up camp, one of the companions said, O Messenger of Allah, have you stopped here because of the revelation that Allah has given you? Or is it simply something which you decided? So the Prophet ﷺ said, it's something which I decided. So the companion said, why don't you go towards the well of Badr, where the water source is? And once the Muslims take control of that, they will have the upper hand. The non-Muslims won't have any access to water. So the Prophet ﷺ agreed and he liked this idea. So he sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Ali and Az-Zubayr to go to the water to see the situation and to secure it for the Muslims. So not only was he a great warrior and a companion that the Prophet ﷺ trusted, but he was someone that was given these types of responsibility, strategic responsibilities to go and to protect the water source in the Battle of Badr. In the Battle of Uhud, when the fighting became fierce, and many of the companions, they became disbanded, and there was only a small group of companions that surrounded the Prophet ﷺ, and they remained firm despite the onslaught of the non-Muslims. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was from amongst them. And he was so fierce in his battle that the Prophet ﷺ would see him shooting arrows and he would say, "O Sa'd, shoot, may my mother and father be sacrificed for you." And this statement amongst the Arabs, "Fidaka abi wa ummi," may my parents be sacrificed for you, was a statement to show how much you honored someone, how much you wanted good for them, how much you agreed with what they were doing. And so the companions would often say to the Prophet ﷺ, "May our parents be sacrificed for you. I would rather my parents died before you." This was out of honor for the Prophet ﷺ. And it's not reported that the Prophet ﷺ said this to anyone other than Sa'd radiyallahu anhu. Sa'd was the only companion that the Prophet ﷺ said to him, "May my parents be sacrificed for you." And it was at this time of Uhud. So he said to him, "Shoot these arrows, may my parents be sacrificed for you." So this again is a great virtue of this companion radiyallahu anhu. He was one of the companions radiyallahu anhu who witnessed the treaty of Hudaybiyah, when the Prophet ﷺ made this pact of peace with the non-Muslims, and he was one of the witnesses to this treaty of al-Hudaybiyah. One of the companions said that from amongst all of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no one more tougher and stronger than 4 companions. These were the strongest companions, and they were Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu an, and Ali radiyallahu an, and Az-Zubayr radiyallahu an, and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiyallahu an. They were known to be the most courageous, they were known to be the strongest warriors, they were known to be the toughest and the strongest companions radiyallahu anhum. So after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is now when we get into his military leadership, how he became a great commander of a Muslim army, and the great battle that he fought radiyallahu an. After the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even during his last few months, the Muslims began to fight the Romans. Spread outside of the Arabian Peninsula, and they went towards the Romans. And the Prophet ﷺ went to go and fight them himself at the Battle of Tabuk. But the Romans failed to show up. They didn't come to meet the Muslim army. And even though there was a distance of 40 days between Medina and Tabuk, they became afraid. And this was one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ, that before a month's journey, they would become afraid. So no one came. So the Muslims returned with war booty, and it was a victory for them. And then in the last months of the Prophet ﷺ, he prepared another army, this time under the leadership of Usama ibn Zayd radiyallahu anhuma, to go and fight the non-Muslims, to fight the Romans in particular, the Byzantine Empire. And then the army stopped when they heard of the death of the Prophet ﷺ. They were still in Medina, preparing to leave, and the Prophet ﷺ passed away. So when Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, and there were many issues that took place in the Muslim empire, people refusing to pay zakah, people apostating from Islam and so on, the companions said, "Oh Abu Bakr, leave the army here to protect Medina, the capital of Islam." And Abu Bakr said, "No, by Allah, never will I rescind an order given by the Prophet ﷺ." And so the army went, and again they were victorious. And so the Muslims during the time of Abu Bakr, they began to fight the Romans and then the Persians. And these were the 2 superpowers at that time, the Roman Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sassanid Empire. Both of these empires were the superpowers, and they would fight amongst themselves as well, each one fighting for superiority over another. And this is something which Allah mentions in the Quran in Surah Ar-Rum, in the 21st juz, the surah named after the Romans. Something which Allah speaks about Himself. And so the Muslims began to fight there. And generally the Muslims were under the leadership of the people there, such as Khalid ibn al-Walid radiallahu an, one of the commanders of the Muslim army, and also someone by the name of Muthanna ibn Haritha radiallahu an, who came from one of the tribes, one of the Arab tribes living near or in between these two empires. And when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to migrate from Mecca and he wanted to leave and go somewhere else, he would go to the different tribes that came for Hajj in Mecca, and he would present Islam to them, and then he would ask them to give refuge to himself and his companions. So from those tribes that he went to before the Ansar of Medina came, was this tribe of Muthanna ibn Haritha in Iraq. And they presented Islam to them, and Abu Bakr was with him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abu Bakr radiallahu an said, "O Messenger of Allah, these are noble people. Teach them about Islam." And Abu Bakr was someone who knew people, he knew the tribes of the Arabs. And so the Prophet ﷺ told them about Islam and he presented Islam to them. And so the leaders of the tribe said, "We haven't heard anything which we disagree with. The message that you bring is a good message. But our issue is that we are in between the Romans and the Persians. And the thing that we do to guarantee our safety, the pact and agreement that we have made between us and them, is that we won't get involved in any of their issues. We're neutral. We don't take sides with the Romans, we don't take sides with the Persians, we don't take sides with the Arabs." And so they leave us be. And we fear that if we take sides with you against the Quraysh, then that will be a reason for them to attack. And so they refused at that time to take in the Prophet ﷺ. But during the time of Abu Bakr, they became Muslims. And not only that, but because they were on the frontier lines, they were the people who led the battle against the Persians and the Romans. This tribe, and from amongst them, from their leaders, was a man by the name of Muthanna ibn Haritha, a great military leader in his own right. And so this continued during the time of Abu Bakr, and many battles were fought against the Romans and against the Persians, and many victories were won. But the Khilafah of Abu Bakr was very short, only 2 years and a few months. And then Umar radiallahu an became the Khalifa, and they continued to fight. And one of the first things that he did radiallahu an was that he removed Khalid ibn al-Walid as the leader of the army, and he appointed in his place Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiallahu an, again one of the 10 companions that was promised paradise, the most trustworthy of the companions, as the Prophet ﷺ named him. And so he became the general of the army, and so he would lead the battle campaign, and he was leading the campaign against the Romans on the Roman front. And then Muthanna ibn Haritha was leading against the Persians. So they were winning against the Romans, and much of the Roman Empire had already come under the ownership of Islam, under the dominion, under the empire of the Muslims. But the Persians were still strong. And the Persians at that time were from the Sassanid Empire. The Persians go back in history a long way, and they had many dynasties within them. Just as in Islam, we had many dynasties. You have the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans. You have many dynasties within the Muslim Empire. Likewise, the Persians had this. During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the empire was known as the Sassanid Empire. And it lasted from the year 224 AD until the year 651 AD. So during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it was the Sassanid Empire. And just before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, before the Prophet ﷺ came, the greatest leader of this empire was born. And he was known as Kisra. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ referred to the Persian rulers as, Kisra. In Arabic, in English, it is Khosres. This is the name that is given to them, Kisra. And so when the Prophet ﷺ, after he had conquered Mecca and after much of the Arabian Peninsula came under Islam, he began to write letters to the different leaders. He wrote to the Romans, he wrote to the Persians, he wrote to the rulers of Yemen and so on, inviting them to Islam. And so when Kisra, the ruler of that time, when he received this letter, and this wasn't Kisra, the Kisra that was the great leader of the Sassanid Empire, but it was one of his children or one of his grandchildren, one of his children. And so when he received this letter from the Prophet ﷺ and he read this invitation to Islam, he said to the ambassador, the messenger that the Prophet ﷺ had sent with the letter, he said, if it wasn't the case that ambassadors are given immunity, I would have killed you. This is how much he disagreed, that he would have even killed that ambassador. And then he tore up the letter of the Prophet ﷺ. So when the messenger came back to the Prophet ﷺ and he told him this, the Prophet ﷺ said, Mazzaqallahu mulka. May Allah tear up his kingdom just as he has torn up my letter. And so the Prophet ﷺ made dua against them. And the Prophet ﷺ told his companions that a time would come when they would conquer the treasures and the land of the Romans and the Persians. This was something which the Prophet ﷺ had promised the Muslims. And so after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, there was great internal strife amongst the Persians anyway. So this leader Kisra, he had a son. And his son, whose name was Hurmuzad or something like this, Hurmuzad, only after 1 year his son killed him in order to become leader himself. And so he killed his father and he became leader. And then after a short while, all of his children killed him. All of his sons that he had, they killed him. And not only did they kill him, but they started to kill one another. They killed him so that now he would no longer be emperor. Now who becomes emperor? There's a disagreement. So now they begin to kill one another until they've killed everyone. All of the male children die. All of them are killed. And so the generals are the ones with the power. The generals are the ones with the power, because they are the ones remaining after all of the sons die. None of the sons remained. So his daughter became the empress, the daughter of this Kisra. And she was known as Buran. And some of the historical accounts of her say that she was an intelligent woman. And so she knew that this internal strife would destroy the whole of this empire. The kingdom would just collapse, not because anyone attacked them, but because they themselves were fighting internally. And so she brought the two great generals of that time, the two leading generals. One, a man by the name of Rustam, and we will mention again later on in this story. And the other, a man by the name of Fairuzan. And she said to them both, that either you two stop fighting amongst yourselves, because the two of them would disagree as to who was the greater general. She said, either you stop fighting amongst yourselves and unite against our enemies, or I will kill you before anyone else has a chance. I'll destroy you myself before someone else even attacks us, because I know that our empire will just be destroyed like this. So they set aside their differences and they united because of her. But because she was a woman, she had to give up her throne. And they found one of the grandsons of this Kisra, a man by the name of Yazdagard in English, or Yazdagard in Arabic. Yazdagard III, he is known. And he was the last emperor of the Sassanid Empire. So he became the ruler. And only at the age, instead of 16 or 17, he was very young. But because he had come of age, the daughter had to rescind from the throne. She had to abscond from the throne, and then she gave it to this man instead. He was a relation. He was from the royal family. And so he, because of his youth, and the Muslims were still attacking the Persians at this time. But because he was young, he was immature, he was a youth, he said to Rustam, the general, the leading general, he said, bring and prepare a massive army. And I want to go and fight the Muslims once and for all. Instead of having these battles over and over again, skirmishes, different places, different times, I want a massive army and we will go and fight them once and for all and finish them off. And so Rustam, who was a general, he was a good general, he was a military general, he knew about warfare, he was hesitant. He didn't want to do this. And so Muthanna ibn Haritha, who was one of the people, one of the Muslim leaders of that time, one of the Muslim generals in that area, he had with him an army of 8,000. And the majority of the army, the Muslim army, was elsewhere. And so he heard that the emperor wanted to establish a great army. And it is said in some accounts that they had 200,000 soldiers with elephants and horses, because the Persians were known to fight with elephants. And so they gathered this massive army under the leadership of Rustam. But Rustam himself was slightly hesitant. He knew about the power of the Muslims, he knew about their determination, he knew about their success, he was hesitant. So Muthanna ibn Haritha, he retreated slightly from the frontier lines, and he sent a letter to Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa in Medina, saying that the Persians are gathering a massive army I only have 8,000 men. So you need to send reinforcements. So when Umar radiallahu anh heard this, he knew that this would be a major event, a major battle. And whoever won, it would be the turning point. And so Umar radiallahu anh sent to the different Muslim tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, he told them to bring out their young men. All able-bodied men should come and fight. And in some places he made it mandatory that any man that can fight must come out and fight. And so they gathered in Medina approximately 28,000 Muslims, an army of 28,000. And so Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, he left out with the army, intending to be the leader of the army. He wanted to lead the army. And he left out with other companions, Ali, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, other great companions as well. And he told Ali that he would be the leader of Medina in his place. He would be the governor of Medina until he returned. And so they left until they came to the outskirts of Medina. And whilst they were there, ready to carry on and to go forth towards Persia, Abdurrahman ibn Auf radiallahu an, a great companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and one of the 10 that was promised paradise, he said to Umar, O Amirul Mu'mineen, it is not befitting for you to go and lead this army. Because if something happens to you, the Muslims will become weakened. So in my opinion, you should go back to Medina and stay there and appoint another general. And so Umar radiallahu an asked other companions, the senior companions, and they also agreed with this. So Umar said to Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who do you suggest? Who shall we bring to lead this great army in this great battle that will be the turning point in this war? And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf said, bring Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu an. And Sa'ad at that time was in a place just outside of Medina. He was stationed there. And so Umar called for him to come. And he made him the leader of the army. And he gave him advice and he gave him instructions and he told him what he expected him to do. And then he wrote a letter telling all of the other generals in the army that Sa'ad is coming with an army and he will be your leader. He will be the general of the Muslims. And so they left out. And they came towards Persia. And then they met up with the army of Muthanna ibn Haritha. So 28,000 with 8,000, 36,000 Muslim army against 200,000 Persians with their elephants, with their horses, with everything that they could have. And they met in a place known as al-Qadisiyah. And that's why this battle is known as the Battle of Qadisiyah. And this is a place in modern-day Iraq. A place in modern-day Iraq. And the Persian Empire was a vast empire. It began from the borders of Europe all the way until Pakistan, Afghanistan, around there. All of that area was covered by the Persian Empire at one time or another. It was a great empire. And so they had a lot of power and they had a lot of wealth. But they met in this place in Iraq, which was near their capital, in a place called Al-Qadisiyah. And this was in the 15th year of the Hijrah. So as the two armies camped in the battlefield and they were waiting, the emperor would say to his general Rustam, he would say, go and attack, finish the battle, what are you waiting for? We overpower them, we outnumber them by 5-6 to 1, go and fight them. And Rustam would delay, he would be hesitant, because he knew that the power was not in numbers. He knew the way that the Muslims fought, and so he would be hesitant. And so from his hesitancy, from one of the things that he did to prolong the issue, was that he called for Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas to send some messengers to him, so that they could come and explain why they want to fight. And so Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, he chose 3 people. A companion by the name of Rib'i ibn Amir, and another companion by the name of Hudhayfa ibn Mihsan, and a companion by the name of al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah radiyallahu anhum. Rib'i ibn Amir, he was the first companion to go. Each one of them went on a separate day. 3 days they went, each one separately. The first day Rib'i ibn Amir went, and he was a companion dressed in dusty clothes, ripped clothes, and he came on his donkey or his mule, and he was carrying his bow in one hand, his spear in another hand. And Rustam, in order to intimidate the Muslims, he had set up a massive tent in which he had silk and gold and cushions and velvet, every type of extravagance that you can think of, so that when these Bedouin Arabs came, they would be intimidated by the glory of the Persian Empire. So Rib'i ibn Amir came, and he came off, and he didn't even come off at the beginning of the tent, but rather he carried on riding his animal into the tent, stamping upon their silk and upon their velvet and upon their rugs. And then he came and he got off, and he tied his mule to one of the cushions. And then he would take his bow in one hand, his spear in the other hand, and he would use them as sticks, walking and tearing up their carpet, until he came towards Rustam in this way. And so Rustam, or one of the guards of Rustam, he said, leave your weapons here if you want to go and talk to him. Rabi ibn Amir said, no, you called for me, I didn't ask to come. So either I go as I am or I go back. So Rustam said, let him come. So he came, and Rustam was on his throne, and he sat down cross-legged in front of him. This was the way of the Muslims. They sat down cross-legged in front of him. And so when Rustam saw that he wasn't going to be overpowered and overawed by all of the magnificence that he had, he began to have a conversation. Why have you come here? And so Ibn Amir said that we have come to take you out from the darkness of shirk to the light of tawheed. And he began to call him towards Islam. And so when he heard this, Rustam heard this, he said, why don't you give me a few weeks or a few months? Let me go back to the emperor and speak to him and his ministers, and let us see if we can reach a solution. So Rabi ibn Amir said, it is our sunnah, our practice, that we only give 3 days. In these 3 days you must decide. You only have 3 days. And then he left. And then the next day another of the companions came, and the third day another of the companions came. And so at this time Rustam knew that they would have to fight, that there was no other solution. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was the leader of the Muslims. He was the leader of the Muslim army. Before the battle began, he became ill. And he became so ill that he wasn't able to sit down. He couldn't sit down. He was so ill. And so he appointed a deputy to lead the army. And what he decided to do was to go and sit on the top of his house, on the top of the fort that they had. And there he would lie down, and there he would oversee the army. And he said to his general and to the army, he said to them, don't attack the Persians until I make 4 takbirs, until I say Allahu Akbar 4 times. So the first time, the second time, the third time, don't move, just stay. And the 4th time I say Allahu Akbar, that is when you attack. So the first day of the battle began, and it is known as Yawm Urmath, the 13th of Sha'ban in the 15th year of the Hijrah. So as this day came, the Persians began to advance. And Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas gave the first takbir, and he gave the second takbir, and he gave the third takbir. But before he could give the 4th takbir, the Persians came and they began to fight. And so Sa'ad didn't give the 4th takbir, but he let the Muslims withstand their army and their force. So they began to attack, and a battle ensued, and there was a lot of fighting that took place in that time. And it is said that on that day 500 Muslims were martyred. 500 from the Muslim army were martyred just on this day. So the day finished, the Persian army went back to their camps, and the Muslims still stayed. On the 4th day, the Muslims began to attack. So this is now when the Muslims took the offensive. And this is known as Yawm Aghwath, the 14th of Sha'ban. And on this day, 6,000 more people came to reinforce the Muslim army. 6,000 more Muslims came to reinforce them. And they were under the leadership of one of the cousins of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, a man by the name of Hashim ibn Utbah. And in this battle, or in this army, this regiment that came to reinforce the Muslims, there was a man by the name of al-Qa'qa' ibn Amr. And al-Qa'qa' was a great military leader in his own right. And he was someone who knew how to deal with the Persians. They lived with the Persians, they knew what the Persians would do, they knew how to fight them, they knew their weaknesses, how to attack their elephants and so on. And so he was amongst them. And so the fighting began on that day, and it was a fierce fight. But it was more in the favor of the Muslims than the Persians. And on this day you have the story of Abu Mihjan al-Thaqafi. Abu Mihjan was a man that was imprisoned by Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, one of the Muslim army. And many of you may have heard this story. And there are different accounts as to why he was imprisoned. Some people say, or some accounts say, that it was because he would drink alcohol. That he used to commit this sin. He would drink alcohol, he would be punished, then he would become weak and he would drink alcohol again. And so Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas imprisoned him. He didn't allow him to become part of the army. Other accounts say that it wasn't because he drank alcohol, but it was because he disagreed with who the deputy should be of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. So because he disagreed, Sa'ad chose to imprison him so that there wouldn't be any issues amongst the army. Whatever the reason, It is reported that on this day, when he saw, on this second day of battle, when he saw the Muslims fighting and what was taking place, and the elephants were charging the Muslims and they were attacking them, and the horses of the Muslims, the warriors, the horses wouldn't stand in front of the elephants. So when the elephants would charge, the horses would flee. So the warriors couldn't face the elephants, and the Muslims would receive many casualties as a result. So when Abu Mahjan saw this, he said to the wife of Sa'd, and the wife of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, she was there and she was in charge of looking after the wounded and the sick and the prisoners. And so he said to her, let me go and fight. Let me go and fight. When he saw that the Muslims were fighting and he was in prison, he said, let me go and fight. And he asked her permission to go. And she said, you don't even have a horse. So he said to her, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anh, he's not fighting. His horse is there. Let me ride his horse and I will go and fight. And so after some toing and froing, she agreed. And so she left. So he left on the horse of Sa'd, and he went out and he began to fight. He began to fight the non-Muslims. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas looked at him and he said to the person that was next to him, if I didn't know that Abu Mahjan was in prison, I would have thought that was Abu Mahjan, just because of the way that he was fighting. And then when he heard later on that it was Abu Mahjan, he allowed him to be freed and to continue fighting. So this was the second day. On the third day and the final day of the battle, Al-Qaqa ibn Amr, he said to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the only way to defeat these elephants is to attack their eyes. They would wear armor, but their eyes would be free. So if our people with their arrows and their spears, they attack their eyes, then those elephants will stop fighting. They'll just die. They'll just stop. And so this is what the Muslims did. And once they had conquered and once they had finished off the elephants, they began to advance. And this was the last day of the battle. And the normal practice was that in battle, at the end of the day, as night came in, the different armies would go back to their camps. But on this third day, even in the night, they continued to fight. And the Muslims continued to advance until they came eventually towards the beginning of the morning of the fourth day. Before the sun rose, they came to the tent of Rustam. And there they found Rustam trying to flee himself, run away, and they caught him and they killed him. And then the Muslims became victorious, and Allah Azza wa Jal gave them this victory on the 16th of Sha'ban, on the morning of the 16th of Sha'ban, in the 15th year of the Hijrah. And this was a pivotal battle, in the sense that after this the Persian Empire collapsed and the Muslims conquered them, and the Muslims took over their lands, and many of the Persians entered into Islam as well. So when Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anh, when he had become victorious, he sent word to Umar ibn al-Khattab that they had become victorious. And Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, every single morning from Fajr or from sunrise until noon, he would stand on the outskirts of Medina, waiting for a messenger to come. Perhaps some news would arrive. And so on this day, again he was waiting. And then the messenger came and he gave him the glad tidings that the Muslim army was victorious. And this was under the leadership of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu wa ardah. So after he conquered Iraq and he destroyed the Persian Empire, Umar radiallahu anh made him the governor of Iraq. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas became the governor of Iraq. And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, one day, he came back to Umar radiallahu anh. And Umar radiallahu anh had heard about some of the complaints that the people had against Sa'd. And it was his way that if he heard complaints, he would ask the governor what was the truth. And so the people complained that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, this great illustrious companion, didn't even know how to pray. They said he can't even pray properly, he can't even lead us in prayer. It was a rumor that they started against him. So when Umar began to speak to him and he came to the truth of the issue, he knew that they were just lying, that they were making rumors against him. So he said to Sa'd, go back and continue to be the governor. He said, no, by Allah, I will not go back and lead a people who don't even think that I can pray. So he refused to go back and he continued to stay in Medina. And when Umar radiallahu anhu passed away, then he was one of the 6 people that he made as a council to choose the next Khalifa. And they chose Uthman radiallahu anhu. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas began to live on the outskirts of Medina. And that's where he spent the rest of his days. So during the time of Uthman, during the time of Ali, during the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu al-jami', he stayed in Medina. And he didn't get involved in the issues amongst the companions and the conflicts that took place. Muawiyah radiallahu anhu once said to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas that in the problems that I had with Ali, in the issues that came between us, You didn't take my side and you didn't take his side. You could have at least taken one side over another. And so Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas said, what would I say to Allah on Yawm al-Qiyamah when He would ask me why I fought against someone about whom the Prophet ﷺ said, he is to me like Harun was to Musa alayhi salam. And this was what the Prophet ﷺ about Ali radiallahu anhu, that he is to me like Harun was to Musa alayhi salam. So he refused to get involved in these issues, and he remained in Medina until he passed away in the year 55 Hijri at the age of 80. And he was one of the last companions radiallahu anhu to pass away, and he was buried in Baqi' in the graveyard of Medina. So this was a brief summary of this great illustrious companion. And before he was a great leader and commander of a Muslim army, he was a great companion of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is, as I said at the beginning, our iman, that we honor these companions, that we love them, that we revere them, that we respect them, but more than this, that we follow their way, that we follow their methodology, that we defer our understanding to their understanding, radiyallahu anhum. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gathers us with the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that He resurrects us in their company and that He allows us to enter Jannah with them. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.